Okay, good morning. That was, I never need an excuse to play Radiohead, but that was their tribute to the last veteran of the First World War who died about this time last year, I think, called Harry Patch. An administrative note first. I wanted to remind those of you who are interested in doing a research paper in place of a final exam that you have to declare an interest in doing so, and ideally come and talk to me beforehand, or at the very least talk to Carrie or Katie, or send me an email to do that. I will need to have some declaration of interest. Many of you are already underway, and those of you who want to do it should really get going. So make sure you do that if you're interested, but you haven't yet got around to it. Okay, so let's move on, because I'm afraid today there's a lot of ground to cover. The Great War. The Great War was a great war, not in the sense that it was full of honor and destiny and all good things. It was a great war because it was unprecedented in its scale, in the degree of industrial violence, and in the very dramatic economic, social, political, and cultural consequences it had. It was the defining experience for several generations of Europeans and several generations of colonial soldiers too. One of these was my grandfather, christened as William Ralph Ellis, but nicknamed Jim, after the Irish trade unionist and socialist leader in Ireland. They had very different types of politics, so his friends thought it was funny to nickname him after someone who had radically opposed political views. And I'm going to give you a sense of my grandfather's experience of the war when we get to it. Let me say a couple of things. It wasn't just contemporaries who felt the Great War to be a seismic event, a life-changing event. Historians also have long considered it to be, to provide a radical change of gear, a defining moment. And probably the first example of that was this satirical publication which parodies the old Whig history of Britain, of sort of drums and trumpets, and here comes another monarch, and there's another battle, and Britain just keeps getting better and better. Written by these two people, W.C. Seller and R.J. Yateman, both of whom were veterans of the First World War. And the book, this story of the triumphant history of Britain as a nation, comes to an end in 1919. It comes to an end not with the armistice, but with the Treaty of Versailles. Chapter 62 is simply called A Bad Thing, and it consists of the following sentence. America was thus clearly top nation, and history came to a period. So there's a real sense for historians, ever since they've begun to write about the First World War, that the world for Britons was never going to be the same again. And basically, there are a number of debates that historians have in trying to make sense of this cataclysmic event. One school of thought suggests that the demands of fighting this new type of total and industrial war meant a decisive end to the liberal version of Britain that I've spent the semester so far talking about. That it demanded an unprecedented degree of state intervention into social, political and economic life, and it effectively meant the end of the old liberal system of laissez-faire. Moreover, in order to win the allegiance of the soldiers who were fighting for it, it became a harbinger of a new type of social contract between the population of Britain and its government. Now, some people argue that the First World War brought that shift. Other people say, look, that trend has been going on for a while. And they would point, for instance, to the types of changes that I've been highlighting to you going on from the 1870s and 1880s, with people becoming increasingly aware of the frailties and vulnerabilities of the old liberal political economy. There is then a third position, which is to say that the Great War really changed very little at all, that it was a type of bubble, and that beyond it, Britain quickly returned to an attempt to rehabilitate the vision of liberal England that had existed beforehand. And many people argue that this lasts down to the experience of the Second World War. So, such is the dramatic nature of this war that, really ever since it's happened, historians have been eagerly debating what were its consequences and what did it change and how. I want to begin then this lecture by trying to show the way in which, at the beginning of the war particularly, people believed or hoped that the war was a continuation of the Victorian dream of liberal progress. And in a way, the outbreak of the war was sold to the British people in precisely this type of way. Okay, that the British people had a duty to respond to the great march of German militarism and tyranny. That Prussia had given rise to Germany. This was a tyrannical and militaristic state, and it was opposed fundamentally to the freeborn liberties that Britain had long cherished and held. So that Britain's job was to defend liberty and defend freedom. The invasion of Belgium by Germany provided a fantastic propaganda opportunity for the British government and the British press. And there were consistent reports of German atrocities, of the rape of women, of the shooting of men in cold blood. And this was used to try and appeal to the British population's sense of honour and decency, and a call to their duty, particularly to their masculine conscience, that you can't possibly let the Germans treat these poor defenceless Belgian women in this way. And of course the key thing was that Belgium was neutral, and Germany had not respected that neutrality. They had offended the rules of statecraft, of international law and statecraft. And of course the inference of all of this is that if you don't stand up and do your duty, it will be your women and children who will be next. The vicious Hun will soon be at your own front doorstep, and it will be your women marched off into forms of gross indecency. Very quickly then, the war becomes associated with a new type of masculine patriotism. And in a way, this, I say new, but in many ways, it's very much a product of the very increasing sort of imperial and militarist culture that had proliferated in the Edwardian period around things like the South African War, the Boy Scouts, and all of this stuff that I talked to you about last week. Very critically, we have to remember that Britain's army for the first 2 years of the war was a volunteer army, that men volunteered en masse to go and fight in France against Germany. 2.5 million men volunteered to fight this war between August 1914 and January 1916, when conscription is finally introduced. And clearly men had doing that because they believed in the importance of the war. But it's also the case that men are doing it because if they stay at home, their masculinity is being called into question. And I want to illustrate this through this rather bizarre organization called the Order of the White Feather, okay, which was established by the leading woman anti-suffragist, the woman who had argued before the war that the women should not have the vote, named Mary Ward. And she established this order at the outbreak of the war in August 1914, and quickly gained the support, and this is important, quickly gained the support of Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. So here you have the arch woman anti-suffragist and the two sort of leaders of the militant suffrage movement joining force, both calling for the introduction of universal male conscription, that the state should compel all men to go and fight. They hold recruiting rallies, and Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst even rename their paper Britannia, such as their rush to embrace the patriotic cause. Now, what the Order of the White Feather does is go round and hand out white feathers to those men of fighting age that are left in the country. The white feather to demark cowardice. And here you see a poster saying, "Is your best boy wearing khaki? If not, don't you think he should be? If he does not think that you and your country are worth fighting for, do you think he's worthy of you?" Okay, so the point is that women have an active role in fostering the patriotic citizenship of men to go and fight. Okay, so all of this still seems within the realm of the old masculine imperial rhetoric of the late Victorian and early Edwardian period. And the other great example of this is, of course, the sort of a heroic cult that builds up around T.E. Lawrence and his role in the in Mesopotamia, in basically the Middle Eastern theatre of war in what is now Iraq. Now, on this front, okay, there is still the association of war with a type of boy's own adventure. You know, you can ride around on camels, you can wear fancy headgear, okay, you can embrace different cultures, you can sit around drinking coffee. It was, it seemed exactly like the boy's own adventure comics that had inspired so many young boys to become imperial adventurers. So the old romance of war, if you like, is still very much alive in this theatre. The experience in Europe is, of course, fundamentally different. And very quickly, this idea that the war could continue to build upon, indeed consolidate, the forward march of liberal progress is called into question. The Great War was an imperial war. Okay? It's fought not just across the sort of length and breadth of Western Europe. It's also fought in North Africa, in East Africa, and in what we now call the Middle East. And it's fought by troops mobilized across the British imperial system. Indian troops, you'll remember, had been key to the maintenance of Britain's empire, not just in South Asia, but across the Indian Ocean, the world of the Indian Ocean. Indian troops then become vital to the British war effort. They fight in East Africa, they fight in Mesopotamia, and they fight on the Western Front itself. And the same is true of the Dominion soldiers from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, and from South Africa. All of these countries have significant numbers of casualties. So of the 1 million British casualties during the First World War, 250,000 of those are colonial soldiers. The Indian, Canadian, and Australians basically all lose around 60,000 men. New Zealand, about 17,000, and South Africa, a little under 10,000 troops. So massive scale of casualties, okay? Not just in Britain, but across the empire. And as I said, one of the reasons why, well, I haven't said this, but I'm about to, one of the reasons why the casualties are so great is because of the new technologies of murder that are first deployed in the First World War. This is a war fought after the Second Industrial Revolution. This is a war fought with technologies that were the product of that industrial revolution. Basically, war had become industrialized. And that enabled one to engage on the battlefield at increasing distance, with increasing anonymity. Okay? First here, the first account I should give you here is of the rifle. Okay? This is not a rifle, but the breech loading rifle, which was developed in the 1860s, was an enormous innovation upon the muskets that had been used in the last great European war, the Napoleonic Wars, at the beginning of the 19th century. The musket basically had a range of about 50 to 70 yards. Okay? The breech loading rifle, you could not only load much more quickly, it had a range of about 500 yards. Okay? Suddenly you didn't necessarily have to see the whites in the eyes of the person that you were about to kill. But the real destruction came with the machine gun. The first early machine gun had been called the Gatling gun, and it had been developed in America by a Mr. Gatling, and was then deployed by the British in a series of wars in South Africa from the 1870s. Okay? By the time of the First World War, however, the machine gun is a much, much more sophisticated machine than the old Gatling gun. The machine gun was able to fire 600 rounds a minute, 600 rounds a minute, over a range of 4,000 yards. Okay? There's a massive intensification of the ability to kill. At the start of the war, Britain had 1,000 machine guns. By the end of the war, it had close to 40,000 machine guns in operation. And as you'll see later on in the lecture, one of the key elements of this industrial war is the ramping up of the industrial production of armaments. for the first time. Two other things to mention before I move on here, which will give you a sense also that this is a new type of industrial war, was the use of flamethrowers, which were new, and the reason why these people are wearing headgear was, of course, because of the use of mustard gas, basically perfected in the chemical industries that were the product of the second industrial revolution. And, of course, there was a new style of artillery. Okay? Massive, massive guns. Guns up to 10 inch in diameter, firing enormous missiles. And not just firing enormous missiles, but the invention of a new type of barrage bombing. Intense, frequent, prolonged bombing to prepare the battleground for the forward march of the infantry. This was saturation bombing. Okay? It was, if you like, the artillery version of what in the Second World War was going to become the saturation bombing by air. And finally, the use of tanks. Okay, the ultimate industrial killing machine. These tanks are very early tanks. They don't have big artillery guns on them. They have machine guns, basically mounted machine guns. Okay, they don't play the key role that they were to play in the Second World War, not least because the conditions, the mud on the Western Front was so bad that they were actually pretty immobile. So totally a new type of warfare, and as ever, whenever you get something new, not entirely new. That is to say that there continued to be a big reliance, even in this highly mechanized industrial type of warfare, upon the use of horses, of bullocks, of cows, to move equipment around. There's a very famous memorial in Kilburn Tube Station to the 483,000 horses and cattle killed during the First World War. Unlike the Mesopotamia theatre then, the experience on the Western Front was not one of mobility and adventure. It was one of being stuck in the mud and being basically immobile and waiting for death. This ghastly, ghastly form of trench warfare that went on for 4 years with armies barely moving at hundreds of yards. The great battle that characterized the mass slaughter of the Western Front was the Battle of the Somme. On the 1st of July 1916, on one day, there's 60,000 casualties and 20,000 people killed. Throughout the duration of the Battle of the Somme, it stretches into November, there are 420,000 Britons that die, 195,000 French, and 650,000 Germans. So, do the math. It's close to 1.2 million people killed in the space of a few months. Now, you would think that facing these ghastly conditions, that men would flee. And yet the remarkable thing is, in the British Army, that the use of military discipline was actually remarkably slight. There are 50,000 court-martials, and court-martials for people being absent without leave, or insubordination to officers, or for a few for self-inflicted wounds, trying to get home wounded. And only 3,000 death sentences in these court-martial proceedings for desertion. Okay? Remarkably small percentage given the size of the British Army of over 3 million. Now, you could, of course, argue that the 346 people shot for desertion, many of whom there's been a long-running argument may have been suffering from shell shock, and their relatives have tried to have them pardoned for their offences. You could argue that those 346, it's not the numbers that matter, it's the exemplary form of punishment that keeps their comrades in check. I've just always found this is from a movie clip. I've just always found this just such a haunting and ghastly image. Okay, so let me tell you something about my grandfather. As I told you, he was nicknamed Jim. He came from a deeply respectable and affluent middle-class family in Hounslow, which, for you to place it, is basically where Heathrow was built over, Heathrow is built over where he used to live. So respectable that I'm wearing his signet ring, which I only ever do when I do this lecture. I have the family silver, which is to say, you know, the very posh knives and forks that came down through his line, and various other silver ornaments. He was privately educated, as people of that class increasingly were from the 1870s, and in the private school that he attended, he joined the officer training corps, okay, as all boys frequently did at this point. When he graduated school, and there wasn't really an exam, you pass 18, and basically he decided that he was going to sign up. And by the time he's 19, he is sent to France. He gets trained down in Oxford, and then he's sent off to France. His parents are unspeakably proud of him, unspeakably proud of him. They produced this volume of basically a typed up story of, it's called Ralph's War, I think, if I can find the front page. It is called A Young Subaltern in Flanders, Lieutenant W.R.E. Larking, 8th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, Territorial, Letters Home, edited by Dad. A simple record as told by extracts from his letters home of my son's military career while with the British Army in Flanders, 1917 to 1919. This book, which I found basically when my grandmother died, is a remarkably cheerful book. It tells of these heroic, fun adventures and what an amazing time he had. Okay? And yet, he is in the heart of the action in 1917. He's at Passchendaele. He's involved in the Third Battle at Ypres. These are like ghastly offences. In this Third Battle of Ypres that he's involved in, 310,000 British died, 260 German casualties. I knew that he was a veteran of the First World War because he was gassed, and so his lungs were constantly full. You know, every time he coughed, it sounded as though he was drowning. And as a kid, and I'm talking about, I don't know, being under 10, I should think he died when I was about 15, going to stay with him, and almost every night of his life, and we're talking now in the 1970s, so 60 years after this war, every night he would wake up screaming from nightmares, screaming with this ghastly, these ghastly lungs full of fluids. So he never, ever wanted to talk about it. Never wanted to, because I was beginning to get interested in history. He just was not going to go there. However, he remarkably, a few years before he died, said to my mother, I want to tell you this story. Okay? And so he sat down and got her to type up this account. And I want to just read out two extracts. I want to read out the extract that is in the journal of the parents, and then the actual, his account 60 years later. This is the journal. On August the 16th, we got news, scanty though it was, a field service postcard saying he was well, and 2 days later came a letter saying, just came out of a most wonderful stunt, untouched. Okay? This is his account of that most marvelous stunt that he emerged untouched. Taken up by Colonel Ingerpen via Hoog to take over a line at West Hook Ridge. Informed that I was to lead the line of the divisional attack at dawn on the 17th. Terrible approach through mud, tracks lined with dead mules and horses and unburied human dead. Continuous shelling, pouring rain, mud and floods everywhere. Led up Battery A Company, leading back B Company on the left. C on the right, D in reserve behind West Hook Ridge. Shelled all night, but mainly directed at support trenches and communications to rear. Assembly trenches full of dead and in terrible state of confusion with the outgoing battery who had suffered heavy casualties and achieved nothing during their previous attack. Went over at dawn, supported by a 1,000-gun barrage. Subjected to heavy machine gun fire from pillboxes and concrete forts. Within a few minutes, I'd lost all the men in my platoon. And as they fell, they slid into a swamp about 3 foot deep in mud and water. With my only contact, Platoon Sergeant Mills, we drifted to the left to avoid the swamp, and I picked up a few survivors of the company on the left and some men from the next division. Tried to make a defense position in a mass of waterlogged shell holes. Waited to see what would happen on the left and the right. It goes on and it goes on. And it doesn't get any, believe me, it doesn't get any better. It concludes, I led out 108 ORs and ordinary regulars and found that I was the senior sub, I'm not quite sure what that means, with 6 other junior subs, all that was left of the officers. We went in 19 officers and 700 ordinary regulars. We came out 7 officers and 108 ordinary regulars. I mean, ghastly scale and experience for any human being. Many men that went through this experience felt then that it was impossible to convey that experience to anyone who had not been through it. And probably the ultimate sign of this experience was the discovery of shell shock. But there were lots of men who returned basically broken by the war. 2 million returned wounded, 400,000 went on disability pensions by 1918. They had a whole government department set up to try and figure out for the first time what disability pensions people would get. How much money you get if you lose an arm. How much money you get if you lose an ear. How much money you get if you lose a testicle. How much money you get if you lose half your face. Yeah.
I remember they measured a guy's leg, and it was like a certain amount of money for how much his leg was gone, and that it wasn't all the way above the knee. You get a certain amount of money for it.
On the other hand, this is the first time that soldiers get any type of pension. So, of course, what became the sign of this broken generation was not just the people on the streets with no legs or no arms or no ears or bit missing body parts. It was also the people psychically wounded. And shell shock, basically, the traumatic experience of war and the generation of shell shock was really something that became a massive source of medical investigation during the Great War. And of course, was an experience in a way made famous by the writing of the great war poets Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. If you read, I was going to play you a clip of Owen's Anthem for Doomed Youth that he writes when he's up in this Cradle hospital up in Scotland being treated for shell shock, but I don't think I have time. 80,000 cases of shell shock, and importantly, they're subjected to a whole range of treatments. Okay, they're subjected to water treatments, they're subjected to electric shock therapy, they're subjected to all sorts of things, but they're also become really the way in which Freudian psychoanalysis begins to make an impact in Britain. Because particularly in Cradle Hospital up in Scotland, there's a doctor who tried to develop the talking cure, okay, to try and work with within the beginnings of the reception of Freud in the UK. Okay, any questions about that before I move on to the last part of the lecture? You have to remember that these wounded and damaged people are everywhere visible. There are hospitals and recuperation homes scattered across the country. Often, they're in old stately homes down long, leafy drives tucked out of view. Sometimes they're right in the middle of a town. Okay? So they become, and this is true in the 20s and 30s, they become a real sign of this generation's experience of war. Okay, so I want to talk now about not the immense cultural trauma of the war, but what it meant for the development of a new type of state and a new type of economic management that was fundamentally at odds with the principles of liberal political economy and laissez-faire. And I'm going to do it under these headings, and I might skip one of them if I run out of time. Let's talk first then about the war economy. When war breaks out in August 1914, the first thing that the state does is pass the Defence of the Realm Act, DORA. And DORA gives it unprecedented powers to requisition stuff and to take control of railways, which were privately owned, armaments factories, some of which were privately owned, and get involved in the purchasing of raw materials and of foodstuffs. So the state, in one fell swoop, suddenly gets involved in a range of activities it was unimaginable that it could have done in the 18th or the 19th century. And it produces a very impressive military machine very quickly. You see here, I'm not going to go through these figures because you can just write them down, but essentially you have the requisition and production of an enormous war machine. At the heart of that process was a single ministry, the Ministry of Munitions, which was created in May 1915 to oversee the production of munitions, and quickly became the most radical, as in innovative, government department. It was headed by David Lloyd George, and he of the People's Budget. And by 1920, it had a staggering 20,000 employees. Okay, just so you get this into perspective, even, that was the size of the entire civil service of the 1830s. So you have one government department in 1920, the size of the entire state a century earlier. And that ministry is basically in charge of an enormous amount of the workforce. By 1918, 60% of the workforce is engaged in war work, and they're doing it in two different ways. Through national factories that the government sets up itself. There are 340,000 workers engaged in these national factories, and this is massive factories. You remember how I was talking to you about how the average size of a workshop in the 1900 was about 30 people? You know, how late large-scale industrial production came. The First World War, arguably, is the moment when industrial production on a large scale finally arrives in Britain. So in national factories that the government sets up, and in the so-called controlled industries like the railways, industries like coal, industries like iron and steel, vital to the war effort, but privately owned, but now under government control. That private ownership is basically put on suspension. One of the reasons why the Ministry of Munitions becomes such an innovative government department is because it is experimenting with how to make workers more productive, how to get workers to produce more. And in order to do that, they hire our old friend Seaborn Rowntree. Okay? And because Rowntree is deeply interested in the development of workers' welfare, forms of workers' welfare, in order to increase levels of production. So a great example of that is that the Ministry of Munitions has these 800 welfare supervisors, and their job of these welfare supervisors is to go around and check that these factories have decent toilets, bathrooms, that they have restrooms. Restrooms, oh God, that doesn't work, does it? Not restrooms as in what would you call bathrooms, but restrooms as in a place to go and rest and to read in your breaks. That there would be canteens, and this is the first introduction of works canteens, really, so to make sure that the workers had sufficient food, that they could be they could work longer and harder, and they set up workers' housing and hostels. Now, an important element of that was set up in order to supervise the work of women. Now, we all know the story, of course, of the iconic so-called munitionettes, the women who were involved in the armaments industry. There are about 700,000 of these women workers. But there's another 840,000 women doing other types of non-industrial work. But for the munitionettes in government factories, the government gets very concerned that it must look after the moral welfare of these workers. These women who are away from home and therefore pray to, and with income in their pocket. You know, for many women, it's the time that they have, the first decent wages, and that they have to be morally looked after. And it's at this point that the government comes up with the idea, not just of welfare supervisors, but of a women's police service, to make sure that women can police women, to check that they're behaving well and that they're not pestered by their male colleagues. So, the state is involved in industrial production to an unprecedented degree. I now want to switch to the story of rationing because it's about the way in which the state becomes involved in distribution. Okay, not in production, but in distribution. And I'm going to do this very quickly. You know, because I've already told you this, that basically Britain had switched to becoming a nation dependent upon cheap food imports. Okay? And that the Germans therefore felt that a great way of getting of weakening the Britain's war effort was to use U-boats to destroy merchant shipping, to stop the food coming over from North America and Latin America. One of the consequences of that is that food becomes increasingly short, and therefore prices rise very dramatically. There are these very long queues, and even the return of food riots that hadn't been seen since the beginning of the early 19th century. No government at war wants to be in this situation where you can't feed your people and people can't afford to buy or can't get hold of food. Worse still, it becomes a real issue of political contention on the left. You have the formation of the War Emergency Workers National Committee, a ridiculous name, but one that was an organization that was very important and made the shortage of food a central component of a series of strikes that began to spread from 1915 and 1916 onwards. The government's response to all of this is to say, look, we can't possibly get involved here. We can't get involved in the market at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to propose that people voluntarily ration themselves. And a whole series of philanthropic organizations are set up, like the National Food Economy League, to try and promote forms of voluntary rationing. So, you know, make sure if you're wealthy that you're not eating too much, basically was the story. The Ministry of Food is established and makes this food economy of voluntary rationing a vital part of its operation, and it develops so-called national kitchens like the one that you see here, which are basically communal canteens where anyone can go and get a cheap hot meal. The idea then is that, you know, if you mass produce food, it will go longer. None of these things basically work. And by January 1917, they abandon all hope that voluntary rationing can work and impose compulsory rationing. Okay? So this is the point in which the state steps into the market in an unprecedented type of way, and the person responsible for this is a young civil servant called Beveridge, who is going to become a very important figure in the following 20 or 30 years. So remember that name. Very interestingly, what Beveridge does is set up a plan of rationing in which he created a consumers' council. So this is the first time a consumer council to advise the government on what consumers most wanted in terms of their rations and provisions. So this is the first time that you begin to see the idea of the consumer as an organized political force. They actually have remarkably little power, but it's a symbolically very important step. So, we've had the government stepping into production, we've had the government stepping into distribution, and these last two things I'm going to talk about are basically the government's control over the bodies of its population. It's going to stop some point, isn't it, this bell? Yes. It's 12 o'clock. So I've already told you that in the first half of the war, Britain was entirely dependent upon volunteers for its soldiers. The scale of the casualties were such in 1915 that it was quickly clear that neither colonial soldiers, many of whom are not volunteers, or volunteers from Britain were going to be sufficient. And finally, in January 1916, the government imposes conscription. This is the first time in the history of Britain that the state has said, you are compelled to fight on our behalf. Remember, for much of the 18th century and previously, Britain had depended upon mercenaries. When they were fighting overseas, they would just hire other people to fight for them, or colonial troops. Always had a very, very small regular army. So for the first time, conscription is imposed for men between the ages of 18 and 41. And by 1918, that wasn't sufficient, so they extend it to people aged between 18 and 51. And critically, they refuse, or rather, refuse is the wrong word, they think it politically not expedient to introduce conscription to Ireland in 1916. Remember, this is the island that had just had the Great Rising, the Easter Rising. But in April 19, conscription is extended to Ireland as well. There is huge argument about the introduction of conscription. Liberals are fiercely, fiercely opposed to conscription. People in the Liberal Party are fiercely opposed to it. The Manchester Guardian, which is, of course, the paper that becomes the Guardian that we can now read outside at the Free Speech Movement cafe, which was the banner paper for the advanced liberals, led a long campaign against the introduction of conscription, as did the Independent Labour Party, which was a pacifist party and hadn't supported the declaration of war. And there was even this organisation, which was basically liberal inflection, called the No Conscription Fellowship. It was full of liberal pacifists. When you get the introduction of conscription, that means you also get the creation of the conscientious objector, the people who refuse to fight, the people who refuse to be conscripted. 16,000 Britons refused to fight, but 3,500 of them agreed to be involved in the war effort in non-combatant roles, as often as nurses or people working supply chains, etc. Yeah, even doing clerical work. "6,000 conscientious objectors are imprisoned for refusing to do any type of war work, and are, of course, treated very badly in prison. Okay? It becomes a big series of campaigns to try and make the public aware of the inhuman treatment of conscientious objectors, who, of course, were not exactly beloved by the regular prison folk. Such was the contempt that they were held in. Remember, if men are getting handed out white feathers when they refuse to volunteer, if you refuse not to fight, it's the lowest of the possible low. And in 1918, these men actually lose their right to vote. Okay? They are told you are effectively not a citizen because you refuse to support the state during the war. Okay, so a much, much more compulsive and interventionist role of the state in terms of conscription and their treatment of conscientious objectors, and their use of internment. Now, no one who lives in the Bay Area needs to be taught much about the history of internment. The islands of the Bay are full and rich in that history. But Britain had never had any experience of internment. Remember, it was only in 1905 that any type of Immigration Act had been introduced. This was a land that thought itself as the land of refuge for people anywhere in the world. By the First World War, that switches around very radically, and basically the German population are increasingly subject not just to abuse, to attacks on their shops, but finally to actual internment from May 1915. 30,000 men were interned, and the women and children deported, even if they had been born in Britain. The German population in Britain fell from 57,000 in 1914 to 22,000 in 1918. And it's during the attacks upon the German-speaking population in Britain that my family's name was changed from Vernum, V-E-R-N-U-M, to Vernon, okay, which sounds altogether more Anglo, or maybe, a little French, and therefore more respectable. So they thought. And finally, the dead, the state's treatment of the dead. And here I am shamelessly borrowing from the work of one of our fabulous graduate students, Andrew Keating, whose dissertation has just been completed on this very subject. So everything that I say is basically plagiarized from Andrew, except for I'm giving you this footnote recognizing his scholarly endeavor, so it isn't plagiarism. An important distinction that you need to know. Okay, so we already know, because I keep telling you that 1 million people in the British military died during the war, that there's a shitload of bodies. Okay? Massive numbers, unprecedented numbers of dead human bodies to be dealt with. It had been the custom for some time that those who were rich enough, families that were rich enough, would try to repatriate their dead bodies of their sons, okay, and bring them back and construct a little memorial to them and all the rest of it. Such was the scale of the casualties, it was really impossible to do that. And the state, moreover, makes a very important decision that there couldn't be an inequality in the treatment of dead soldiers. They insisted that basically that men should be treated democratically in their experience of death. It's a very important step forward. So, and again, this is completely unprecedented. The state basically takes control of dead bodies. It says to the families, I'm sorry, it's your son, I know, but basically we're going to deal with it. We're going to decide where this person is buried. We're going to decide what is on the inscription of the grave. And the organization that becomes central to this was called the Imperial War Graves Commission. Okay, they have a whole commission that basically figures out how they're going to design and build and deal with this problem. They build over 500 cemeteries overseas and have at 400,000 headstones and 100,000 crosses. And as you'll see from this example, have any of you been to any of the great cemeteries in France, Verdun or yeah, Tom? Ypres, you've been to Ypres? And it's like this, fields and fields full of indistinguishable white crosses. And this is very important, okay, that everybody gets basically the same cross. Some have very simple things written on them, most have none whatsoever. Now, as you can imagine, this leaves a huge hole. Culturally, this leaves a huge hole back in Britain itself. How is it that the British population can come to terms with the loss of this many people? And this many people buried in places that most families had no hope of being able to visit. Absolutely no hope. So the response to this was a wave of the construction of war memorials in Britain itself to memorialize the men lost from that town or that village so that they were symbolically brought back to the center of that community's life. The Imperial War Museum in Britain has so far catalogued over 60,000 of these memorials. And almost all of them were raised by public subscription. That is to say that people gave money in order for them to be built. In 1923, they passed an act that says once they're built, the local authority will take over the maintenance of them. But they're basically raised from privately raised funds. And any of you that have visited Britain know that there isn't a town or a village that you can go to that doesn't have one of these things. This is my personal favourite because this is in Glossop, outside of Manchester, where I used to live. You remember I was telling you about that bakery that shut down for Wakes Week? Yeah? The bakery was right here. So this is the town centre. I know it doesn't really work, but it does for me because I've been there. I used to come out of the shop and, oh yes, there's a war memorial. This is a highly unusual war memorial because it's the figure of this winged figure is far more ornate than most war memorials. Most war memorials are very, very straightforward, you know, and in very much in the tradition of design that comes out of the Imperial War Graves memorial. Much plainer, much more straightforwardly monumental, not as delicate or ornate as the one in Glossop. So this is a small mill town, okay? A mill town based came up in the 19th century. A lot of textile mills. I forget what the population is. There's this, but there are also 14 other memorials in Glossop alone for the First World War, many of them in churches or chapels. So it wasn't just the town that remembered its dead. Then every church or chapel often also constructed at their own memorials for the people from their congregation that was lost. And on top of that, many aristocratic families, which still had, you know, their own churches effectively, you know, on the estates, would put up great plaques within the church in memory of their children that were lost. So the dead, I'm suggesting, even though they're kept where they die by the state, even though death is democratized for them in that experience, the British population brings them back through this practice of memorialization at home. Any questions before? Yeah, sure. Well, there was a lot of unidentified bodies, and they're either buried in unknown graves, or or what they often frequently do is, I mean, this is the case in Verdun because I remember this from a visit myself. They build these great chapels in honor of the unknown dead. And so the one in Verdun is actually full of bleached bones underneath. You walk around and you see the bleached bones of the dead. And of course, there are tombs and memorials in Britain. I mean, is it Trafalgar Square? There's one in a tomb to, lots of memorials to the unknown soldiers back in Britain. Any other questions? Yeah, Bob. No. Well, yes, there is. No, there isn't. On, I think we call it Veterans Day here, in the 11th of November. On that day, or for the month preceding it, in Britain, there's a tradition that people wear plastic red poppies. Okay, I'll be wearing. Oh, well, I'm not. We're not going to be. Is it? Yeah, it is November coming up. Yeah, I'll be wearing one, so you'll see it. It's a tradition that people wear this red poppy. Okay, and the proceeds for the sale of the red poppy goes to the Royal Legion. Okay, so many people believe that buying those poppies is supporting and valorizing the military culture that led to these deaths. So they invented an alternative poppy, which was a white poppy of peace, basically. So it's not. There's a relation to the practices of memorialization, but the white poppy is basically a type of protest poppy against war itself. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the contribution project.
Yeah.
Were those tied to any particular religious groups, or was it just a bunch of individuals?
Well, there were lots of reasons why people conscientiously objected. They could do so on religious grounds because, say, they were Quakers, but a lot of Quakers were engaged in non-combatant work. They could conscientiously object because of their politics, because they were on the left and or they were just pacifists. I mean, a large spectrum. Some people conscientiously objected simply because they felt that it would be deserting their family. I mean, for instance, say you were raised on a small farm, and you've got aged parents, and if you go to, if you get called up, then there's no one there to run the farm. So people had arguments that ranged from the ethical to the political to the religious, just to the deeply practical. And there were a lot of arrangements made for people that had that was necessary for the farming community, especially. There are a lot of exceptions. Yeah, Tom. Right. There were, well, I mean, the farming community is the biggest. There were some heavy industrial industries that were protected, but what they did there mainly was to get older men to work them, so that they would try and, it was an age thing, that you could if men say in their, say, I'm 46, so in 1916 I would have missed the cut by 5 years, but I would have been young enough, not really, but I could have been working in a steel mill, for instance, at that age. So anyone under 40 would not be, would have to go in those conditions. So I mean, I think that mining is another example which is a really set of specialist skills and key strategic needs. So there were, but it was a very ad hoc. Not ad hoc. There was a process, but there were lots of variations and different local conditions and exceptions. Yeah.
With so many men being lost, was there any government support for families that would eventually have single mothers coming up?
Yeah, there's a great question. There was a war widows pension introduced. I think after the war, actually, at the same time that the disability pensions were introduced. I think that's the case. There's certainly a war pension introduced, war widows pension, and I just am not clear on the date. Anyone know that? No? Okay, you ready for your earth-shattering Thursday conclusion? I know you can't wait. So I hope that you get the sense that this war was a truly cataclysmic event, that it sent a sort of seismic shockwaves through, through all of Europe and through Britain as well. In many ways, it's an experience that comes to define not just the next 10 or 20 years, but arguably much of the rest of the 20th century in Britain. Okay? Britain emerges, ironically, seemingly in a pretty strong position, and yet, in important ways, it remains really fatally undermined. And we'll come back to that. The key thing that you need to get immediately is that many people believe that the Great War marked the end of the version of liberal Britain that I have been talking about in the semester so far. That culturally, the idea of progress, for instance, the idea of a progressive advance of humankind was irrevocably shattered. Industrial progress had led to industrial death and violence. The idea of heroic imperial adventure had led to the mindless slaughter in the mud of the trenches. It also, the conditions of fighting the war, required an entirely new type of government that violated just about every principle of liberal laissez-faire and political economy. Okay? You have a highly interventionist warfare state directly involved in the production and distribution of goods, in the control of the bodies of its population. Okay? And of course, in 1918, you get the final enfranchisement, the vote given to all men and to some women. So politically, many people think this is a transformative moment apart from the development of the state. I've emphasized that this was an imperial war fought across the domains of the empire by imperial troops. And it's important to remember that Britain emerges from the First World War, or from the Treaty of Versailles, as imperially in a stronger position. It takes over much of the imperial territory of Germany, and it takes over a key role, the key place of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. So ironically, Britain emerges from the First World War territorially emboldened and expanded as an empire state. Now the question is, were the legacies of the war at home ones that would mean a decisive move away from the liberalism of the 19th century, or a return to it? Was the war fought to save what was left of liberal Britain? Was it fought to build a new type of society? And basically, there are arguments on both sides. Some people will say this was the decisive moment of change. Britain was never, the same again. There was a decisive move away from liberalism. other people would see that, in fact, during the 1920s, there's a desperate attempt to return to the shibboleth of liberal political economy. Britain goes back to free trade. It goes back on the gold standard. It gets back into the empire game of fighting like colonial wars left, right, and centre. You're going to see in the lectures that come that there's a real struggle internally in Britain to try and figure out quite what the war was fought for and which direction the country was going to take. And I will leave you to go off and enjoy your weekend.